Thanks for tuning into today's podcast. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our new remote training here at RPP. We've been offering remote training for quite some time, but we always required the athlete to come in-house for an assessment. Now we can do the whole assessment online and bring all of our services, pitching, hitting, and strength training to your doorstep. So, if you like what we do and how we do it, go to our website at rocklandpeakperformance.com and click on Remote Training in the toolbar. Thanks. The Behind the Seams podcast. I'm your host, Nunzio Signore, looking to bring you great dialogue with some of the best in the world of player development. The world of training baseball players has changed dramatically during the past few years, and I'm looking forward to shedding some light here on what's the latest, what's the best, and what's really happening in the world of player development. Thanks for joining me for the ride. Hey guys, and welcome to the Behind the Seams podcast. Sorry I'm a little late getting this one off today. I was at the Bridge Seminar speaking down at Wake Forest at their pitching lab. It was a really great event, a lot of great speakers. Actually, a lot of great friends. This is probably one of the, if not the seminar that I've spoken at in the last couple years where I've known the most people. Guys I've spoken with in the past, guys I've interviewed on my podcast. Just a really great time. Mike McFerrin, the Director of Player Development and the Pitching Lab Coordinator, did a great job. They have a beautiful facility there. And of course, it was always great seeing my buddy Corey Mascara, one of my longtime friends, probably one of the guys I've known the longest since I've opened up my facility 14 years ago. It was great to see him, great to see Sean McGrath, Brian Bannister, Robin Lund, always talking great food recipes with Robin Lund, always have a great time with him. And really making a lot of new friends. Coach McKinley from University of Nevada, Jimmy Boofy, really super smart guy, and the only guy there that actually had longer hair than me. Really looking forward to getting him on this podcast as well. I thought the best thing to do today would be to talk about what I learned at this seminar. Not about what I spoke about, but what other people spoke about. It was a learning process for me as well. I love doing these seminars for the simple fact that a lot of times I just do a lot of talking, and at these seminars I do a lot of listening. It was hours and hours of listening to a lot of smart guys talking about how we can make this game better from all the different angles of player development. Every time one of these seminars is over and I get back on the airplane, I just sit back and have a multiple aha moments like, wow, Brian Bannister's talk was incredible. I've got to implement that. I can implement this. Jimmy Boofy's take on how to analyze biomechanics was just incredible. I got to try to add a little bit of that. And I bring them home and I turn them on to my staff. I get better. The facility gets better. The systems get better. Everything gets better. It's just a complete learning process. So while everyone was great, I'm just going to go through 5 or 6 of the ones that I actually was there to take notes on. I would highly suggest you go see this next year if you get the chance to. It's a huge learning experience from some of the best minds in the business as far as player development go. First up was Coach Jake McKinley, head coach of University of Nevada. He talked about creating sustainable systems in professional and collegiate development. The first thing I want to say is he had this great app that he made everybody shoot a screenshot like you do kind of in a restaurant with a menu. And he asked us questions and took polls live. That was the first thing I saw when we got there. He was the first speaker. And it actually was, I was like, wow, this is very cool. He talked briefly about being the CEO of your team or organization. Does your staff understand the desired outcomes of the organization? For example, does the strength and conditioning coach understand the desired outcome of your pitching program? Does your pitching program understand enough about anatomy, and do they understand the process of assessing athletes that they can walk up to the ATs or your PTs or your strength and conditioning coaches and talk to them about a structural or a movement problem that they see with their pitchers? This creates autonomy within the staff. Then he asked us to take a survey unanimously and asked us if we feel like we actually have a staff that understands the desired outcomes of the organization. So while he was telling us what he thinks is a great way to put systems in place, he made us question our own systems to see if we actually have any holes in our system that we may be able to make better. Another question he brought up was, is your program end-to-end? And what he means by that is, do you look at when an athlete has to be ready. Can you explain at any given moment the process of working back channeling from when an athlete needs to be ready, the complete process of training that athlete, whether it be coming in from your baseline assessment to your strength training, to your pitching, to your mental work? Do you have a program that is end to end from the moment the athlete enters your system to when he has to be ready to play? And that's big. That's actually long-term athletic development within the context of an off season or of a year. And I think it's something that most facilities don't really think about, but most great facilities, it's just a must. One last thing I'll mention is he asked, is it scalable for all athletes on board? Is it scalable for all of the athletes in your program? Is your concept, is your system, is it usable by everybody in your organization? Is it leaving anything unturned for specific athletes? Will a college athlete come into your program, and will there be a hole there that is not allowing this athlete to kind of walk in and hit the ground running? That's really, really important to get autonomy and get buy-in from that athlete. I thought that was a really big one that most people don't really think about. When we put together systems, we kind of put together what we like, what we think is the best thing. And I don't know if we necessarily think if it's scalable for everyone on board. For me in the private sector, that was a really big one. That was a really big question. Fortunately for me, that was one of the things that I answered with a profound yes. A really great thing he did was at the end, he made us ask ourselves questions if we felt vulnerable about a particular area. And he said, if you find yourself being vulnerable, whether it be understanding desired outcomes of your organization, end-to-end training, scalable for all athletes, he said, when you feel vulnerable about a situation, that is going to be a game changer for you once you adjust that. Next up was Brandon Golden, performance coach at 5 Tools Connection, and he talked about assessing and unlocking the individual. Basically, he took us through a baseline assessment that he does with all his athletes, but he did it with an IMU unit that he got from a company called Output Sports. This was a really cool device that he hooked up to his cell phone that helps you alleviate having to use goniometers, help you measure. Thought it was a really great thing that I'm going to look into myself, whereas we don't have to use 2 people to do table assessments anymore. So he actually did a live assessment on an athlete and then discuss the results. This was kind of in my wheelhouse, so I found it very interesting to get another guy's take on how he assesses his athletes, especially with the tech that he used that I thought really could save us a lot of time. So this is a situation where it wasn't so much what he was saying to me personally, but how he was going about getting his results could be a game changer for me as far as saving time and maximizing the accuracy of my results. Some of the things he talked about was assessing losses in hip IR to help with athletes that may be having a problem getting into a hinge. So if we have a right-handed pitcher, a lack of hip IR in that right hip could prevent them from actually loading that back leg to help them get a better hinge and create more force coming down the mound. He also talked about the importance of core stability to help maximize lower half strength. And I thought that this was a really important topic because when I find that when we do our assessments and we check hip abduction on the table, side lying hip abduction, and we brace the core, sometimes guys who have maybe failed that test, once we brace that core, we can find out it's not a lower half strength problem, it's actually a core stability problem. Once we stabilize that core, we can better find out, is it really a lower half strength problem or is it a core stability problem? And I brought that up during the Q&A. I bumped into Brandon a few years back while speaking at Palooza and just was struck by what a really down-to-earth guy he is and just how much he really, really loves trying to make guys better. And I really respect that. The next presentation was one of my personal favorites because it really hit close to home to what I do as well. And that was by Brandon McDaniel, VP of Player Development for the LA Dodgers. I also loved the title of his presentation. It was called Creating Superpowers. And he talked about all the aspects of what is involved in player development and working with high-level athletes and how a lot of times you just don't have choices when you're dealing with guys that are making a lot of money and can really do whatever they want. And he mentioned a really important fact that he has to just be able to bring things up and just hope that they take what he says to heart. One example was when he was talking about monitoring an athlete's sleep. He said a lot of the athletes tell him, I really don't want you to know how much I'm sleeping. And his answer was, I really don't care how much you sleep. I'm just hoping that you actually look to see when you have a good day, you had sleep. When you're struggling, you're not sleeping. So bringing this up and giving the athlete that autonomy to understand what's going on, to let himself make better decisions is a valuable thing. He also talked about remembering that the athlete is the most important person, and sometimes we can forget that. Don't let egos get in the way. As being one of the older guys there, I can also tell you that Brandon was one of the more experienced and older guys there, and it was evident in the way he spoke. I loved the way he spoke, and he also mentioned a lot about not acting or reacting too fast. Good training takes time, and I think a lot of young guys can learn from that. I hope a lot of the guys in the audience, young guys in the audience, learn from that as well. He talked about what characteristics make you really skilled. He mentioned that with 12-year-old and up to college, it's really about being bigger, stronger, and faster. And once you get into college and you have a higher training age and into pro and minor league and pro ball, it's really about maintaining the athlete's strength and power and mobility. And it's really about durability at that point. Couldn't agree more with these young guys. It's obvious. We just need to get them bigger and stronger if they want to compete. But once they get into college and try to get into pro ball, it's about keeping that athlete healthy. On the nutrition side and the weight gain side, optimal weight, he thought, was different for each guy. He has a lot of guys that are just thinner, lighter guys that throw the ball really hard. He is not in a position to try and change that, nor does he want to. Sometimes we can get too hung up on being 2.5, 2.7 times their body height in inches. That works great for young kids, like we said, who need to get bigger, stronger, and faster. But once you get to an elite level, if a guy's performance is great, if he's performing well, I wouldn't try to rock the boat too much. His whole presentation was about how he has to try to make guys better without rocking that boat. Another interesting thing he mentioned was how using the weight room can be more non-threatening environment when mound work isn't working. And I think this is a really telling topic with pitchers who, this is what they do. And when they get on the mound, sometimes if something's not working, it may be a movement or a strength fix, and it may be easier to address that issue in the weight room where they do not feel like everything is on the line. His take on nutrition was really interesting, which I thought had a lot to do with his wife. I believe it was his wife, is a nutritionist. And he talked about gut testing and digestion. And a lot of times inflammation can be causing an athlete to feel full. Like a guy will say, man, I'm eating and eating. I just can't eat a lot. I get full really easy. Well, you're really not eating a lot if you're telling me what you're eating. This may be an inflammation problem. So he can implement an elimination diet where we can kind of clean the toxins out of the body, get the athlete back to square one, get rid of some of that inflammation, and see if their caloric intake can go up without them feeling so full. This was, for me, the biggest aha moment of this presentation for me personally. All in all, this was a really well-rounded PowerPoint presentation on using all the tools that we have in our toolbox by a guy who's been doing it for a while and has a really relaxed and focused way of getting his point across. And I really attribute this to experience and being around the game for a while. I'm going to interview this guy on my podcast because I think that him and I will have really great conversations in the future. Kristen Nicholson, lab director and head of biomechanics at Wake Forest, did a really good presentation on how research papers that her and some of her colleagues have done at the university on how well med ball work transfers to the performance traits that they see when analyzing mocap. Kristen has also been a big help to us here at RPP in regard to going back and forth, me talking to her about mobility work that we kind of prescribe when we see certain mocap issues, and her talking to us about, she just has such a great amount of data from being at Wake Forest. She has really good experience and outlook on certain issues that if I sometimes have a question, I'll pick her brain a little bit. So we have this ping pong that goes back and forth that I really, really appreciate her friendship and her knowledge. In this presentation, she looked at a couple issues such as lead leg knee extension velocity, as well as back leg force, and she correlated them to two drills that they tested, a med ball shovel pass and a med ball chop or overhead med ball chop or throw, as I like to call them. And it was very interesting to see how certain drills correlated to what we saw on what she saw on the mocap, and certain drills just did not correlate at all. In this presentation, I really got the most out of the data that she was showing in her mocaps. Once again, it was really telling for me to let us know how our athletes are comparing, how our system, we both use a Qualis system. It was really interesting to see how similar or dissimilar results were in markers such as lead leg, knee extension, angular velocity, as well as back leg force. So next up was Jimmy Boofy. This is one of my new favorite guys. So the night before, I just have to tell this little story. The night before, there's a meet and greet at a brewery, and Robin Lund, a good friend of mine, and Jimmy pull in. Robin Lund's with this little guy with long hair, and Robin comes up to me and says, "Nunzio, what's going on?" I said, "Hey, man." I said, "Who's the little guy with the long hair?" He said, "Oh, that's Jimmy Boofy." And I was like, "Ah, okay." Because the story is, I had reached out to Jimmy and had asked him a question about a biomechanics question about mocap, and he never actually responded to me. So when Robin introduced me to Jimmy, Jimmy looked at me and said, "Oh, Nunzio," and I said, "Yeah, I reached out to you a while back and you never responded." And he had this blank look on his face, and I was like, "This is beautiful, man. This guy just doesn't know what to do." But in the end, I ended up speaking with him a lot over the weekend. Great guy, super smart guy. The guy's got a PhD in biomedical engineering and a BS in mechanical aerospace engineering. Worked with the Dodgers and now owns his own company. Really, really good spirited guy. This is another absolute podcast guest in the future. I've always heard about Reboot Nation, but I never really knew what they did. What they do is they can take your mocap data on a specific player or players or a team, and they can analyze it and bring you back actionable reports. It really helps. Like, I consider us having a really already great existing data-driven program, but with a guy like this that can actually check some boxes for me, it not only helps my program get better, it helps me get better at understanding the reading of mocaps. He talked about three major things when he's analyzing mechanics: movement efficiency, that's energy in and energy out. He talked about transferring momentum within the body, and he actually talked about transferring momentum to the ball. He basically broke down the kinematic sequence in more of a physics way of looking at things. So number one, he looks at how efficient of a mover the athlete is by looking at his mocap. He's looking at how much energy is going into the movement and how much energy is coming out. It's a really simple way of looking at things, but a crucial way of looking at things. When he talked about transferring momentum within the body, he talked about force need to be in the same vectors in order to be efficient. In other words, making sure that spine and that arm are perpendicular and they're rotating on the same plane. If not, we're creating energy leaks. And as far as transferring momentum to the ball, he said a real interesting thing. He said the spin direction of the body dictates the spin direction of the ball. And this was really, really key when he mentioned that great hitters can pick up the ball path from the body before it even leaves the hand of the pitcher. So giving that away with the spin direction of the body is something that we need to take into consideration when we're watching a pitcher's mechanics. What I like the most about this presentation is that Jimmy took a really, really technical topic and really broke it down to make it really palatable for the pitching coaches and the player development guys in the audience, and myself included, that really don't have as much of a background as he does in biomechanics and physics. Okay, next up were the three amigos, as Corey Mascara likes to call them. Corey Mascara, the pitching coach at Wake, Mike McFerrin, player development at Wake, and Chris Lewis, data analyst at Wake. Interesting story on Chris Lewis. This guy gets up there to speak with Corey and Mike, who I know well, and I'm like, wow, I think that's the guy that came in for a data analyst internship during COVID, and COVID happened, so we never got a chance to work with him. at RPP, which is really a shame because after listening to him talk, he's going to be a really great young mind in the business from listening to him speak. Corey kind of took the ball on this one like he always does in true Corey Muscara manner. He's just a really, really passionate guy when he talks. He has a really down to earth way of delivering what he wants to say, and it really hits home really fast and really hard. The name of their presentation was called Building the House. Great name for this because they talked about what you do to actually build something from the bottom up, from the foundation up. And it really was a basic outline of the player development at Wake Forest and how they take an athlete and work him from the ground up. Some of the main takeaways from this was Corey talking about what does it take to win. You know, he was straight up honest. Listen, guys, I really, really want to get these guys better, but I really want to win. Competition is a skill, so we have to teach some guys how to compete. We may have a really talented guy. He just doesn't have that inner drive. And what Corey's always been really, really great at is addressing that skill to a guy in such a down-to-earth way. I'm laughing because I've heard him do it live at Maryland, and it's really something to listen to. It's just authentic. Some of the things that Corey talked about that he looks for in a pitcher are leg times, time between pitches, hold times, tipping pitches. These are things that are really important to him, things that he looks at as general characteristics in a guy and what we need to work on with this player when he gets to Wake. Him and Mike and Chris went on to talk about how they use their lab. They broke it down into finding and creating value, finding prospects. Corey said, you know, he heard about a guy and sometimes he'll call Chris up and Chris is just one of these computer whiz guys that can just get on a topic, get me all the information you've got on this guy. And then Chris comes up with the answer within 5 minutes on a callback. Mike talked about keeping athletes healthy and how their ability to use their trainers and their strength and conditioning coaches, and also being connected with a hospital to help with interplay with athlete assessments. And then the thing that I thought was most interesting, how they build out their systems. And once again, back to what Jake McKinley was talking about, they kind of backtrack it. They start with ball flight, which tells them how the body is moving. And then once they see how the body's moving, they analyze the biomechanics data to see how the athlete is moving down the mound. And then from there, they'll see, is it a strength or is it a mobility issue? Is he strong enough? Does he have stability? Does he have mobility? And then they'll leave it in the hands of the strength and conditioning coaches to work on that. Or if everything flushes out there and they know that it's just a biomechanics problem and they deal with that on the mound. Corey then talked about creating routines, forming new habits. You know, if he gives pitchers the objectives and lets them see what they're doing, they'll hold themselves accountable. It's that autonomy that I always talk about. This was a great presentation and done really well considering there was 3 different guys speaking and it was pretty much seamless. Last up for the evening was Brian Bannister. I interviewed Brian on my podcast a couple weeks ago. Super down to earth and super intelligent guy. This was a PowerPoint that I actually am going to call him and have him send me because I really need to sink into this. It was very complex, but it was incredibly, incredibly insightful and really interesting. Brian talked about how he sees pitchers many times make a local or what he calls an isolated change to an individual pitch. And by doing that, they move the entire pitch arsenal globally, all the pitches, when they're only trying to really move one. He mentioned to use changes to the grip or seam orientation to achieve local or isolated pitches to not be global. His process was identify what pitches hitters can't hit, reverse engineer pitch requirements of those pitches, identify the pitches, and design a global arsenal and local shapes. It was a lot to digest for someone who honestly is not a pitching coach, but it made complete sense. He also said the game is getting smarter every year, so you have to do things differently. He said this is a very different way of trying to change movement on the ball that will confuse hitters. He ended his PowerPoint by saying optimizing the relationship between 2 pitches together will outplay working on 1 pitch at a time. This guy I can see why he's such a big player in player development and pitching in the MLB. He brings such a different way of looking at it. And I really attributed that to he continually talks about himself as an artist, which I really, really respect. He actually went to USC to become an animator, and he really, really learned a lot about movement by, he said, looking at animation and how guys watch the body move. Just a really, really interesting and great guy to hang out with as well. So there's a few of the PowerPoints. That surely wasn't all of them, and I had to leave early today, and I'm really, really bummed that I couldn't see Emily Faree, my buddy Sean McGrath, and Robin Lund. I'm really bummed out that I'm going to miss those two guys' presentations. They always bring a lot to the table. But once again, if you can get to this next year, I highly, highly recommend it. It's one of the greatest seminars that I've ever presented at, and that says a lot. Kudos to Mike McFerrin and the whole entire Wake Forest pitching lab and staff and player development crew. They did such a great job. They were great hosts. The facility is beautiful. I have nothing but great things to say about it. Looking forward, hopefully, to doing it again next year with them. And really psyched to get a bunch of my new friends here on the podcast. You can reach me at Nunzio Signore on Twitter. My facility is Rockland Peak Performance. That's www.rocklandpeakperformance.com. And until then, have a great weekend, and I'll see you on the next Behind the Seams podcast.